This Sunday, the threat from Russia.
We are ready no matter what happens.
More Russian troops massing on Ukraine's border.
Russia's aggression today not only threatened Ukraine, it also threatens Europe.
The U.S. sends 3,000 troops to Eastern Europe.
We're going to make sure we reassure our NATO allies in Eastern Europe that we're there.
Vladimir Putin breaks his silence and says the U.S. is ignoring Russia's security concerns.
When he puts 100,000 troops along the border, I think we should be prepared for further incursions.
And gains an ally in America's superpower rival, China. My guest this morning, President Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. Plus, Pence rebukes Trump.
President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election.
Mike Pence responds to Donald Trump's claims he could have overturned the election. This as the RNC censures Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for participating in the January 6th investigation.
All of those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
And calls the Capitol riot legitimate political discourse. I'll talk to Mr. Pence's former chief of staff, Mark Short. And the NFL's race problem.
I think the numbers speak for themselves. One black head coach.
Some 20 years after the league pledged to do better, why do NFL coaches still look like the old boys club? Joining me for insight and analysis are former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, Amy Walter, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Cook Political Report, Matthew Continetti of the American Enterprise Institute, and Helene Cooper, Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history, this is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
And a good Sunday morning. In 2008, during the Summer Olympic Games in Beijing, Russian troops invaded neighboring Georgia. The then Prime Minister of Russia, Vladimir Putin, declared from Beijing, war has started. In 2014, Russian troops moved into Crimea just days after Putin returned from the Winter Olympics in Sochi. And now with the Winter Games underway in Beijing and with Putin in attendance, the world is left to guess, is Putin about to pull the trigger again, this time on Ukraine? U.S. plans for a diplomatic boycott of the Games have largely fizzled, and Putin has found an ally in China's leader, Xi Jinping. On Friday, Putin met with Xi, who offered strong support for Russia in its standoff with the West, at least publicly. The two issued a joint statement saying friendship between the two states has no limits. China has offered political support to Russia over Ukraine, including blocking U.S.-sponsored action at the UN Security Council. Our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, has been covering the buildup of Russia's military forces. He's on the border of Russia and Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. And Richard, this is a case, I think, of watch what they do, don't necessarily listen to what Russia says. What do you see, Richard?
Well, we're seeing a massive military buildup. This is unlike anything I've seen since the American 2003 buildup before it launched the war in Iraq. And I think that's why we're hearing these really dire intelligence assessments coming out from U.S. officials that if there was a war, there could be 50,000 Ukrainians killed, 25,000 soldiers, 10,000 Russian troops, 1 to 5 million refugees or internally displaced. And these dire warnings are now being heard in Ukraine. For the last several days, several weeks, people had been living in a kind of suspended disbelief that maybe this was just Russia bluffing, that Russia was trying to get some diplomatic advantage. Now people are starting to believe this could happen, and it could happen potentially imminently. So we're starting to see rallies in government in major cities. We're seeing more and more people signing up for volunteer service. We're hearing more of a fighting spirit from people. When I ask people, what are they going to do? And they say, we will fight until the end. And I think because this country won't be a walkover, that's why those intelligence estimates are so high for what the cost might be. But Ukrainians also know that if it comes to fighting, they are going to have to fight Russia by themselves, that NATO has promised support. It's sending in some weapons, but at the end of the day, NATO isn't coming in here to help them. So Ukrainians will only have their own troops and their own defense systems like these trenches to fight off Russia.
Richard Engel, like I said, he's on the border right now of Russia and Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. Richard, thank you. And joining me now is the National Security Advisor to President Biden, Jake Sullivan. Jake, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start with this warning that you guys gave to lawmakers that has now come out, and that is the intensity of the Russian military buildup, what they have there. You heard Richard's report. Many Ukrainian leaders now see that this appears to be an even bigger threat than they determined. What's your sense of how soon something could happen?
Well, Chuck, we're in the window where something could happen. That is a military escalation, an invasion of Ukraine could happen at any time. We believe that the Russians have put in place the capabilities to mount a significant military operation into Ukraine, and we have been working hard to prepare a response. President Biden has rallied our allies. He's reinforced and reassured our partners on the eastern flank. He's provided material support to the Ukrainians, and he's offered the Russians a diplomatic path if that's what they choose instead. But either way, we are ready, our allies are ready, and we're trying to help the Ukrainian people get ready as well.
The diplomatic path, what does that still look like? What are we willing to negotiate? Missile sites, things like that? What are we willing to talk with the Russians about?
We're prepared to sit down with the Russians alongside our allies in NATO and other partners in Europe to talk about issues of mutual concern in European security. And yes, that includes the placement of certain range systems of missiles. It includes transparency around military exercises. It includes greater capacity to have confidence building and to avoid incidents that could lead to escalation or miscalculation. We've laid all of that out in a paper that we sent to the Russians after coordinating it carefully with our allies. That paper is now out in the public view, and the world can judge for itself just how serious we are. But what we're not prepared to negotiate are the fundamental principles of security that include an open door to NATO for countries who can meet the requirements.
Jake, it seems to me that you guys have united NATO allies and European allies on a response if Putin does a full invasion. But the question I have is, if it's not that, but it is something else, trying to maybe politically annex parts of Ukraine, things like this, how much more work do you have to do to get European allies ready to have a robust response?
Well, Chuck, I'm glad you asked that question because the Russian action could take many forms, including the possibility that they annex the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine known as the Donbass. Or they could take a series of hybrid actions, including cyber attacks, political destabilization, things along those lines. Or they could do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And part of the reason that we've been working so intensively over the last few months is not just to prepare for one contingency, but to prepare for all contingencies and to work with our allies and partners on what a response would look like in each of those instances. We believe that we have strong alignment with our allies, that we are on the same page when it comes to severe economic consequences and the other forms of pressure that we would impose in response to any kind of Russian action that amounts to aggression and escalation against Ukraine.
How much more of a challenge is this? Europe has not found a way to have independence from Russian energy. You could argue they should have spent more time over the last 10 years doing that. In the case of Germany, in some ways, they seem to go closer to Russia. How much does that hinder a unified response that might actually have some teeth?
We believe that the Europeans intend to step up and impose severe costs and consequences. But again, you've asked a great question because it is true that Europe has distance to travel when it comes to weaning themselves off of Russian gas and diversifying their energy supplies. President Biden has directed his team to look to find from other places in the world LNG, liquefied natural gas cargoes that can be sent to Europe in the event of a contingency, so that the United States' help to Europe isn't merely in the deployment of troops or the supply of economic aid, that we can help coordinate the delivery of gas to keep Europeans warm through the rest of the winter. That work is well underway, and President Biden and Chancellor Scholz will discuss it further tomorrow when the Chancellor is here in Washington.
Last week I had Senator Rob Portman, Republican senator from Ohio, on, who I know has been basically been in coordination in some ways on Ukraine policy with the administration. And he said to me, it's his understanding in private that Germany has given the United States assurance that if Putin invades Ukraine, the pipeline is done, that they are willing to suspend the pipeline. But they won't say that publicly. Will the German chancellor say that publicly with the president tomorrow?
I'll let the German chancellor speak for himself, but the Biden administration, at President Biden's direction, has been absolutely simply clear on this. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward. And Russia understands that. We are coordinated with our allies in Europe on that.
What's the definition of invasion?
That will be the reality if Russia chooses to move forward.
Right. What's the definition of invasion there, though?
Well, President Biden has spoken to the fact that if a Russian tank or a Russian troop moves across the border, that's an invasion. That is an invasion, and the result of that, from our perspective, would be the imposition of severe economic consequences.
And if the Germans giving you that reassurance on Nord Stream 2 that anything that crosses the border is an invasion and therefore suspends that pipeline?
I'm not going to get into our diplomatic discussions with the Germans because I think it's important that we be able to coordinate with them. What I can tell you flatly and plainly one more time is one way or the other, if that happens, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
Got to ask you about the Olympics here. We tried to organize a diplomatic boycott. 9 other countries joined us, not even the entire G7. We've talked about Germany. We know why they're not perhaps on board here. France either. How disappointing is it that this is the West? These are the 10 countries that seem to prioritize human rights, while many other of our allies apparently prioritize economic ties more than human rights?
Well, Chuck, I have to say that the premise of your question is not quite right. The United States did not go around the world knocking on every country's door trying to, quote unquote, organize a diplomatic boycott. What we did was come out and make a statement of principle about what we, the United States, were going to do. We were not going to send an official delegation to these games because of the grave human rights abuses of the Chinese government. And we did have some countries join us in that. Other countries made a different decision. But if you look at the broad level of alignment with our European partners, with the Quad, with our Asian allies, you can see like-minded democracies coming together on a range of challenges that China poses, whether it's in the realm of military aggression or in the realm of economic coercion or in the realm of human rights. And our statements at the G7, our work at NATO, our work through the Quad has all laid that out. And we stand a year into this administration stronger and more united with our allies when it comes to China than we have been at any point in recent memory.
Would China be in line for any punishment if they help Russia get around sanctions?
Well, the sanctions that we're going to impose will, in fact, have an impact on China because they will go at the financial system of Russia, which, of course, engages the Chinese economy as well. And so China will have a choice whether or not it complies with the sanctions, or if it chooses not to comply, then, of course, there are penalties that accrue to that. But fundamentally, from our perspective, we believe that Beijing will end up owning some of the costs of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that they should calculate that as they consider their engagements with the Russian government over the next couple of weeks.
Do you have any reason to believe that Xi advised Putin not to do this?
I don't have any direct evidence that he did one way or the other. I would note something interesting, though. In the more than 5,000-word statement that Russia and China released when President Putin visited Beijing on Friday, the word Ukraine was not mentioned.
Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor for President Biden. Appreciate you coming on, sharing the administration's perspective.
Thank you.
When we come back, former Vice President Mike Pence rebukes Donald Trump for saying Pence could have overturned the election. I'm going to talk to Mr. Pence's former Chief of Staff, Mark Short, who was with Mr. Pence at the Capitol during the January 6th riot. Welcome back. 2 events on Friday helped illustrate the centrality of January 6th and its aftermath inside the Republican Party these days. First, the Republican National Committee censured Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for participating in the Congressional Committee investigating January 6th. Hours later, former Vice President Mike Pence said Donald Trump was wrong when he claims that Pence could have overturned the 2020 election. Mr. Pence made his remarks as more information has emerged on Mr. Trump's efforts to stay in power after losing the election.
President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election.
Former Vice President Mike Pence on Friday, responding to Mr. Trump's false claim that he could have rejected the Electoral College results. Pence also breaking with Trump on the insurrection itself.
January 6th was a dark day in the history of the United States Capitol.
As the National Archives announced it is preparing to release his records to the committee next month. The January 6th committee has issued dozens of subpoenas, interviewed 400 witnesses, and obtained over 50,000 documents. Under this increased pressure, Mr. Trump is now defending the insurrectionists.
If I run and if I win, we will treat those people from January 6th fairly. We will treat them fairly. And if it requires pardons, we will give them pardons.
Among the recent revelations about his efforts to overturn the election, Mr. Trump reportedly directed his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to ask the Department of Homeland Security if it could legally take control of voting machines in swing states.
He needs to seize all of these Dominion and these other voting machines that we have across the country.
A question he also raised with Attorney General Bill Barr regarding the Justice Department.
I see no basis now for seizing machines by the federal government.
In Georgia, a criminal probe is heating up, centered on the phone call Trump placed to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger on January 2nd, demanding he produce more votes in a state Joe Biden had won.
I just want to find 11,780 votes. So tell me, Brad, what are we going to do?
We realize that we're coming to a place that there are enough people that will require a subpoena for us to speak to or for us to be able to get information. And so, yes, we're headed into phase 2.
In addition, Mr. Trump attempted to employ a slate of alternate electors. Memos published this week by the New York Times were used by Giuliani and lawyer John Eastman as they developed a strategy intended to exploit ambiguities in the Electoral Count Act.
You should exercise your prerogative to legislatively designate a slate of electors.
On January 4th, Trump and Pence met at the White House with Eastman about his memo, laying out steps Pence could take to delay certification and keep Trump in power. In effect, a blueprint for a coup. With Mr. Trump squeezed, his allies are hitting back. A year ago, on January 6th, the RNC issued a statement saying its members strongly condemned the violence, calling it an attack on our country and its founding principles. But now,
all of those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye. The Republican Party declared Friday the January 6th attack was simply ordinary citizens engaged in legitimate political discourse. Joining me now is Mark Short. He's Mr. Pence's former chief of staff. Short was with the vice president at the Capitol on January 6th, and he recently testified before the House January 6th committee. Mr. Short, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Chuck, thanks for having me.
Let me start with the motivation of your former boss, former Vice President Pence, and why this week did he choose? In fairness to him, he has said something similar in the past, but he chose to give a big platform to this week. Why?
Well, Chuck, I think that, as you mentioned, the vice president has commented on January 6th on several occasions, including last summer at the Ronald Reagan Library. And he extended those remarks a little bit this week at the Federalist Society, primarily because the president's comments about the vice president had the ability to overturn the election, I think, merited response. Of course, there's nothing in the 12th Amendment or the Electoral Count Act that would afford a vice president that authority. It's why no vice president in 200 years has ever used that authority, and it's certainly not one that I think conservatives or Republicans would want Kamala Harris the ability to say she's going to reject votes from Texas or Wyoming or any other state heading into 2024.
Well, why did he stop there? Why didn't he say, look, it's been a year. There's just no evidence out there. This was a free and fair election. The Trump-Pence ticket lost. How come he didn't go that far?
Well, Chuck, I think like a lot of people, the vice president has significant concerns about the election. I think because of COVID.
Still?
Because of COVID, sure. I think that a lot of us do.
But there's been no evidence of fraud. You could disagree on the election law. But,
yeah.
I understand that.
So I think there were significant concerns about what transpired in Pennsylvania, what transpired in Wisconsin, what transpired in Georgia when you said you had to have matching signatures. You didn't. You had election officials overruling state officials and saying we'll keep the balloting open, allowed universal access and mail-in balloting. But at the same time, the Constitution is clear as what that process is. You're afforded a chance to challenge. You're afforded a chance to bring legal challenges. But at the point of the Electoral College meeting on December 14th, at that point, the process is concluded. And that's why the Constitution wanted the states the ability to certify elections and not for the federal government. It's very clear, in fact, in the Federalist Papers. They warned about the threat of a federal government having that sort of authority.
Do you believe Joe Biden was a legitimately elected president? Does the former vice president
I believe that Joe Biden is duly elected president of the United States, yes.
Legitimately so. The election was legitimate. You may disagree with voting procedures, but the election itself was legitimate.
Well, I mean, I think it's the same question. I think that there were significant concerns about the process of that election that's going to create a cloud. But I think, Chuck, at the same time, to your point, the campaign had opportunities to bring that evidence up till December 14th and didn't. And so I think at this point you have to assume that he was duly elected. And the reality is that there was not enough significant fraud that was presented that would have overturned any of those states' elections.
Doesn't it say a lot that a year later that actually the more evidence has shown that no fraud happened? I mean, doesn't that even reinforce this even more a year later?
As I said, I think there are significant concerns, and I'm glad many states are looking to rectify, Chuck. But I acknowledge that the president's duly elected.
When did you? I want to go back to the time before January 6th. You guys were under a lot of pressure. You were in the room when they were done. When did you conclude that all of the potential allegations that were out there, that they were baseless?
I'm not sure that all the allegations out there were baseless, Chuck. I'm not confident of that. But I think the reality, again, is we're asking what's the constitutional role of the Vice President of the United States? We're governed by rule of laws, not rule of men. And the reality is that he was following what the Constitution afforded the Vice President under the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act. And he was doing his duty, which is what he was required to, under an oath to the Constitution to defend it.
Had he gotten legal advice, I know he talked to Judge Luddick, had he gotten legal advice that said, well, you can't decide which electoral votes are yes and no, but you can adjourn this session and delay things. Had he gotten legal advice to do that? Was the Vice President considering it?
No, Chuck. I think, unfortunately, the president had many bad advisors who were basically snake oil salesmen, giving him really random and novel ideas as to what the vice president could do. But our office, researched that and recognized that was never.
Are you chalking this up to bad advisors, or was the former president seeking the bad advice?
I think I don't know the answer to that question. I think that, honestly, he did get a lot of bad advice. But I think that it was not something that the vice president, from the very beginning, he counseled the president that I don't think I have that authority. Always willing to look at something that you want to send our way, but never thought he had that authority.
So when he asked you to meet with John Eastman, and you met with him first, why did you meet with him before the vice president did?
I actually did, and I did meet with them consequently after they had the Oval Office meeting. So we did have a separate meeting between Greg Jacob, myself, and John Eastman.
What were you trying to get clarified?
I think at that point there had been a push to say, would you simply reject ballots? And then at some point when it became crystal clear that that was not something that the vice president knew he had the constitutional authority to do, there was a switch to talk about sending it back to states in the last 24 hours of that.
Did the president ever ask his own White House counsel if any of this was constitutional?
I think you'd have to ask Pat Cipollone that. I'm not sure what those conversations were.
Did you guys ask for the White House counsel's opinion on this?
I'm sure that Greg Jacob was in touch with them, and I think that Greg provided us with plenty of great counsel.
When was there any point that the vice president was looking for a way? Because I've seen reports he said he wanted to look for ways that he could show empathy or sympathy for those that wanted to object. Was he looking for a way to delay the process at any point?
No.
So there was never once somebody was pressuring. He didn't feel like he had to do that. He was just looking for better words to choose. Is that the fair way to look at it?
No, I don't think he was looking for better words to choose, Chuck. I think that the vice president was crystal clear from day one that he didn't have this authority. But again, keep in mind, he was proud to work with this president on doing so many great things for our country, whether or not it was securing our border, providing tax relief, taking on China, confirming judges. It was an amazing record. And so if the president asked him to consider a different approach, he's going to look at it, but never meant he thought that he had that authority.
Going to January 6th, when your colleague, Mr. Jacob, gets the text or the email from Mr. Eastman and he essentially says, this seizure is the vice president's fault for not acting, what was the vice president's response?
Greg, I think in the heat of the moment wasn't really going to worry us with what John Eastman was saying. I think we had those conversations subsequent. But in the heat of the moment, the vice president's concern was how do we make sure we get back in and complete the work we were assigned to do today? And wanted to make sure that he was in touch with Leader McConnell and McCarthy, as well as Pelosi and Schumer, and saying how are we going to make sure that we get back in tonight so the world sees that our democracy is functioning and working.
Did the vice president ever talk with the president that day? on January 6th while he was in the Capitol?
They did not have conversations.
Did he try?
I had a conversation with the chief of staff during that.
And at what did you get evidence? Was the president checking on the vice president's safety at any point in time during that period?
I think it was communicated by both Keith Kellogg and by myself to Mark Meadows.
Communicated what?
That we were safe and secure in the location that we were in.
Describe what you saw that day.
Well, I think that from the time that the vice president was evacuated, I came back up to his office in the suite right off of the Senate floor. And at that point, Secret Service had tried to move him twice, but the vice president was resolute and said, I'm not going to let the free world see us flee in the Capitol, and I'm staying. But the third time, the head of our security, Tim, said, there's a glass door here, and I can't protect you. We need to move you. And at that point, they evacuated us into a secure location at the bottom of the Capitol. At one point, there was an attempt to, again, put the vice president into a motorcade. Yeah. But he was clear to say, that's not a visual I want the world to see of us fleeing the Capitol. And we stayed there and worked to try and bring the business back together and complete the work that night.
Did you ever hear those chants, hanging Mike Pence?
I did not.
Did he ever did?
I'm sure we've all seen it.
Now, you've seen it since then, but in the moment, had you heard it or any of that?
In the moment, I did, and I don't know whether he did.
What was your reaction when you heard it?
I mean, look, I think that, again, there was a sense of tragic day, sense of loss, but also a sense of that pride in what we'd accomplished for 4 years and feeling that this was going to be an unfortunate taint on that record and looking at some of the people who we never recognized as people we saw in rallies traveling the country. And I think it's unfortunate that for 74 million Americans who voted for the Trump-Pence record, that in many ways that's tarnished by, candidly, Chuck, some of the media want to portray all those 74 million as represented by a few hundred thugs who were at the Capitol that day.
Did you see legitimate political discourse that day?
From my front row seat, I did not see a lot of legitimate political discourse. But, Chuck, to your question, in talking to some members of the RNC, I think there is concern that there are people who were there peacefully protesting who have been pulled into this, what I think is more become a prosecution by the January 6th committee, and feel like they're being unfairly treated.
Let me ask you about a few other things that have come to light. Did you hear anything about seizing voting machines?
Did not, no.
You were not. Nobody tried to bring you into these conversations. What about the alternative slate of electors? Did anybody tell you that they were organizing alternative slate of electors?
There were discussions about alternative slates and certain letters that we received. But, when we had a conversation with the parliamentarian, she made it clear that, candidly, every year they receive notes from random Americans saying, here's my slate of electors.
Right.
And so, unless they're certified by the state, they're candidly meaningless. And so didn't put much weight into that.
If the vice president is subpoenaed by the January 6th committee, is he going to cooperate?
I think that would be a pretty unprecedented step for the committee to take. It would be, I think, very difficult for me to see that scenario unfolding. I think
you've cooperated, though. Well, and how should they read this?
I was compelled to cooperate via a subpoena. Right. I don't know how often you've been subpoenaed, Chuck, and if you view that as cooperation, but I view that as following the law.
Right. So, obviously, the former vice president, if he's subpoenaed, he's going to follow the law?
I think it's very different to subpoena a former vice president to talk about private conversations he had with the president of the United States. It's never happened before, and I think we have significant concerns about the committee, Chuck. The committee truly is not really a bipartisan committee. When it was set up, it was supposed to have 5 appointees.
Whose fault is that?
I think when Speaker Pelosi rejected Kevin McCarthy's appointees, I think it made this a much more partisan adventure.
The rejection was the Senate Republicans rejecting a bipartisan committee. Was that the initial mistake?
You know as well as I do that Nancy Pelosi rejected Jim Banks and rejected Jim Jordan from serving on that committee, based on the basis that they had not voted to certify the election. Think about that for a second, Chuck. The chairman of this committee voted not to certify in 2004 Bush Cheney. Right. Where's the mainstream media looking at his decision?
But Mark, the issue
other
was
members on that committee who also...
The Senate Republicans shut this down. That's why we don't have a bipartisan committee.
There was going to be a bipartisan committee as well in the House, Chuck. And Kevin was not afforded the opportunity to put his 5 people on because she decided to unilaterally reject both Jim Jordan and Jim Banks. So it has put this committee on a very partisan track.
So you don't agree with Mitch McConnell that what the committee is finding is quite interesting and quite legitimate?
I am hopeful that the committee does end up providing an impartial review, but I think there's good reason to be skeptical that they will, because truly it has taken on a more partisan committee.
Would Mike Pence serve as Donald Trump's running mate if asked ever again?
I'm not going to try to answer the hypothetical. I think that Mike Pence, every time he's considered what he's going to do, he's taken time to pray and say, what is our family being called to do, and where can we best serve? That will be a decision he uses.
Knowing the former vice president, I know he would say he will always try to have a relationship with the former president. But realistically, is that relationship severed?
I don't know that it's severed. I think that the vice president remains incredibly proud of what they accomplished for 4 years. He really does.
None of the former president's actions has made him question the character of the former president, whether this was...
I think that he's been very clear commenting about what happened on January 6th and where he disagrees with the former president.
But he sees it as just a disagreement on issues, maybe not a character or a moral mistake.
I think he's been very clear to say that he believes that the president was wrong, believes the president was given bad advice on that day. It does not take away from what they accomplished working together for 4 years for the American people.
Does he still think Donald Trump should be the leader of the Republican Party?
I think Donald Trump has an incredibly important voice in the Republican Party moving forward. I hope that the president looks forward. I hope he looks to talk about what are we going to do to fight inflation? What are we going to do to re-secure our border? What are we going to do
think it's a mistake
to
that he
end these
focuses
silly
so much?
virtue signaling and mass mandates in schools? We should be looking forward more
So you
than
think
looking
he's
back.
making a mistake how often he looks backward?
That's up to the president. I think our party should be looking forward and not backward.
Mark Short, former chief of staff to the former vice president. Thanks for coming on.
Chuck, thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
When we come back, the growing pro versus anti-Trump rift in the Republican Party. Is it a real rift? Panel is next. Welcome back. Panel is here. Amy Walter, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Cook Political Report. Former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson. Matthew Continetti of the American Enterprise Institute. And Helene Cooper, the Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times. Well, Mike Pence, Mark Short, what'd you learn, Amy?
This tightrope that Republicans are forced to walk and will continue to be forced to walk, at least for the conceivable future. You know, there is this theory that you can have Trump without the Trumpism, right? Whatever comes next will look more like Trump in terms of who's the next leader of the party if it's not Donald Trump. Will look a lot more like him than a Mitt Romney, than a Liz Cheney. I think that's true. But the next question is, how many times will Republicans have to go back and pretend that January 6th was not as significant as it was, or agree with, or have to answer for it was legitimate political discourse, or was this a free and fair election? Was this legitimate? That puts the party then firmly, they have not, even as much as they try to, they have not been able to cut from Donald Trump.
Jay.
It is amazing to me that the RNC can label January 6th legitimate political discourse, and it's probably true that there's a lot of the Republican base that will accept that. I mean, to most of us, that's the equivalent of saying the World Trade Center didn't collapse on 9/11. What's interesting is the rank and file seems to be moving closer and closer to Trump's point of view, while people like Mike Pence are moving away from him.
Yeah.
And what the former vice president said legally was immaterial. We all know that he didn't have the power to reject the election result, but he's obviously become more assertive in his political rhetoric, moving away from the Trump base.
Matthew, and maybe I'm squinting too hard to see it, but it does seem like the more Donald Trump squeals about this, the more there are people going, we got to push back. We got to stop this Electoral Count Act. And even the RNC tried to water down, and then they came up with this, to me, a stain that I don't know how they ever get rid of. Legitimate political discourse feels like something the RNC, it's going to haunt them for decades.
And the Democratic ads write themselves. I mean, you can just see it from this program. You contrast that statement with the video from January 6th. There's your attack ad. I think the Republicans believe every minute they spend talking about 2020, January 6th, is an opportunity lost. You heard it from Mark Short. Yeah. They want to talk about inflation. They want to talk about masks. They want to talk about the border. Unfortunately, the person who's making them look in the rearview mirror is President Trump. And he wants to force the issue, I think, to the detriment of the Republican Party. And I would say to his own detriment, too. People forget Trump had a forward-looking agenda when he ran for president in 2016. All he cares about now is revenge.
It's pretty clear. And there's no coherency to it.
No, there's not. It's really sad. I've been kind of I've been thinking about this a lot in the past few weeks because I've been upset, as a Pentagon reporter, I've been focused on Russia and Ukraine. Right. And there's always been this expectation of American exceptionalism when you look at other societies where you see strongmen rulers and you see a society accepting things that from the outside we see as completely crazy. And now I don't have this feeling of American exceptionalism anymore because I think what happened on January 6th and the reaction of the Republican Party to it since then has shown that we're as easily led as anybody else.
You know, Jay, it's funny, and I'm going to draw a long line here, but I can't help but wonder our inability to get the world to follow us on a diplomatic boycott of China on something that's fundamental about sort of what we believe should be freedom bigger than financial ties makes me think, well, maybe the example of our democracy is not so good, so people are thinking, why are we following you guys? I mean, it's hard not to see that.
The first thing that I thought of after January 6th, following up on what Helene said, we used to say peaceful transfer of power, peaceful transfer.
Made us different.
Yeah. Right, and made us different. We can no longer say that. I actually think that the situation with the Olympics is somewhat unique. I believe that our response to Ukraine actually has been a nice reminder of how coalitions led by the United States can respond effectively.
Assuming we're effective. Assuming the response is effective.
Well, it does. As we sit here, it does seem as though Vladimir Putin is on the defensive at the moment.
I think that's a fair.
And the coalition, I believe, has served as a multiplier effect on the pressure that can be put on him as opposed to going it alone.
I guess, Matthew, the question, though, going back to the issue inside the Republican Party is, you do have Mitch McConnell that is sort of the Bill Belichick mindset on to November and focus forward. But Kevin McCarthy doesn't have that luxury. It seems like he has to appease this wing of the party more than McConnell. This feels like this is inevitably going to continue to cause more problems.
Well, it's going to cause a lot of problems, especially if the Republicans take back Congress, as they look to be on the path to doing. Right? And right now they have no agenda. Yeah. Think about the Republican Party. The last time they put out a platform was 2016. So we get legitimate political discourse, but we don't get a platform. We don't get an agenda.
Speaking of ad lines, you just wrote another one.
It's the truth, you know? And so you get into a position where the Republicans are in power next year. Yeah. All of these fights are going to come out into the fore if you don't have substantive policy to rally behind.
Well, they do have substantive policy, theoretically, which is we're going to be whatever the opposite is of what Democrats and Biden are doing, which is what, I think you raised this earlier, which is what every Republican in the Mitch McConnell mode is trying to talk about. Yeah. But many of the Republicans who are going to come to Congress, remember, they're coming because not only were they endorsed by Donald Trump, but because they sought out that stamp of approval and feel as if it is their job to take that into Congress, not to just simply be a voice against whatever policies.
Helene, I want to spend this last minute pivoting a little bit more to Ukraine in this respect. The U.S. has wanted us to take their word on a lot of allegations they've made against the Russians here. It seems as if this is a weird stance to take when we don't like when the Russians do the disinformation game. We need to have a little more trust but verify here, and they seem to be on the defensive. Why aren't they being more forthcoming?
They will tell you that they're not being more forthcoming because they're trying to protect intelligence assets.
If I hear the phrase sources and methods one more time, it is such a crutch.
It is. I mean, the scene at the State Department briefing this past week between Matt Lee of the AP and Ned Price was. We all love Matt Lee. He's great, but he was completely right. And Ned saying, read what I said, and that's that doesn't necessarily work. But
You're just the spokesperson, right? That's not evidence.
We're entering a new phase right now of information warfare that the Biden administration is trying to wage against a master in that game, which is Vladimir Putin. But, they haven't done that poorly so far.
Well, there you go. We're going to pause here. When we come back, the NFL in race. It's been nearly 2 decades since the NFL promised to increase minority hiring using something called the Rooney Rule. So why is there only one black head coach in the league right now? Stay with us. Welcome back, Data Download Time. What should have been an exciting time for the NFL leading up to next week's Super Bowl has turned out to be a week of headlines about racial inequality in the league's upper ranks after recently fired Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores filed a class action lawsuit alleging racial discrimination in the league's hiring process. The suit sparked a lot of discussion about the discrepancies between who calls the plays and who executes them. And this is a case where the numbers just don't lie. Here's obviously the makeup of the league. 70% of the league is made up of players of color. It's pretty clear. Now look at the distinction of head coaching rights. See, 70% of the players are of color. 3 out of 32 head coaches right now are of color. 26 of the current head coaches, so there's still some vacancies, belong to white men. Now let's take a look at why this is. For the last 10 years, the NFL has tried. They've had the Rooney Rule. The league has tried to encourage these owners to essentially do better. They've not required it. They've kind of coerced. Well, they haven't done so well. Among head coaches in the last decade, there's been 51 white head coaches, just 11 of color. General managers, the ratio is about as poor, 31 overall, just 6 of color over the last decade. And if you look on the coordinator level, among offensive coordinators in particular, it's a terrible ratio. And guess what? It's offensive coordinators that are suddenly getting all of the head coaching hires these days. It's slightly better among defensive coordinators, still though, 2-to-1 basically, white to non-white when it comes to those there. And then look at coaches overall. One of the problems here for coaches of color is they don't have family ties in the league. Of the 792 coaches, basically more than 10% of them have relatives, are related to other coaches in the NFL. And look at it among head coaches. A third of NFL head coaches are related to other coaches. As you know, one of the coaches is the grandson. In the Super Bowl this year is the grandson of a former NFL coach. When we come back, the NFL just pledged to do better on the score again. Is there any reason to believe them this time? Stay with us. Welcome back. Baseball may claim it's the national pastime, but the NFL is these days. Jay, look, I think the NFL's popularity means we believe it needs to culturally be with or ahead of the country, not so far behind. But the NFL continually looks like it's much further behind, really, than any other sport.
Well, first, I need to be a little careful here because my law firm represents the NFL in the league. Certain matters. All right. When I look at those numbers, first of all, the most interesting statistic you put up was the familial connections between and among coaches. I had not seen that before. But when I see those numbers, first thing I think of is 1973. I'm old enough to remember when the league, all the quarterbacks were white. Mm-hmm. And 1973-74 was huge in that all of a sudden the Pittsburgh Steelers had a black quarterback, Joe Gillum from Tennessee State. Mm-hmm. It's Black History Month. And today, depending on how you count, there's something like 10 starting black quarterbacks in the NFL. Progress can be agonizingly slow sometimes around this issue.
You know, Amy, the league's been under pressure before, and they've whiffed on these things. And yet they get away with it because they keep making money and the game's so popular. But look, the league put out a statement admitting that you can't look at one black head coach and say they've succeeded. So they're admitting it. I think they have an ownership problem.
Yeah, that the owners, are there any owners of color?
Not right now.
It's all white owners, all of a certain age. It also looks a lot like...
Billionaire Robert Smith is among those that might bid for the Denver Broncos. That could be an interesting development.
Now look at the NBA, which also has most of its players are black players, and yet 40-something% of its coaches are black. So it is possible to do this. There isn't like, oh gosh, it's just too hard to get a pipeline. There's a pipeline there. It's just that there's not the incentive, as you pointed out, and you have to be very intentional about this. So intentionality isn't just putting out a statement saying we have this Rooney Rule, so go ahead and interview. Intentionality says, no, we're going to set metrics. We're going to make sure that at the end of each one of these interviews or at the end of each season, we're going to assess this, and that the owners themselves will self-assess and be intentional. That's just not happening.
You know, it's easy to pile on Roger Goodell. People love to jump on him. But this is a case where, now you could say he's been weak in how he did it, Matthew. but he's tried to create incentive like, come on, guys. We got to get better here. We're going to do a second Rooney. Now you got to do 2 interviews. We'll give you a draft pick. They didn't get the hint.
No. And, the NFL, because of the way it's structured, Goodell has only so much leverage over these owners. And at the end of the day, it's the owners who make the decisions and the GMs who they also hire. And so it's going to be on a very personal decision. Until you find some leverage or some way to incentivize even further to have more black coaches, I'm very pessimistic about the chances. Because another thing we haven't mentioned, too, is the coaching trees. Right?
Yeah, right.
So you have one Super Bowl coach. Yeah. And all of a sudden, all the other teams, they start to hire all of his assistants.
Oh, except with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, that didn't seem to happen.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, they had two coordinators that didn't get hired, both African-American, after they won the Super Bowl last year.
So the NFL has a lot to overcome before they have more diversity in the coaching.
Helene, you were comparing the situation to the Premier League and saying, boy, it's stark there, too. And Premier League actually has an NFL owner in it.
They do.
Yeah.
They also have, both the Premier and the Championship League have black coaches as well over in the UK. But the reality is and this is all you could say this about any different corporation, the whole American corporate structure. I mean, this is not just football. This is all. I mean, basketball is a little bit different, but this is a symbol of American society where the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a small percentage of white people. And the only reason why this is so glaringly obvious with the NFL is because we're watching it every Sunday and Monday, and because so many of the players are black.
Well, at the end of the day, go ahead, Amy.
Oh, no, I was saying that's exactly right. It's a structural issue that is not just about one game.
Well, I'll be very curious to see how the Denver Bronco sale goes, because that is an opportunity at a minimum for them to try to at least show symbolic acknowledgement of this inequality issue. Anyway, that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the Olympics, and remember, if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press. The Meet the Press Chuck Todd Cast, free wherever you get your podcasts.